So today's cardinal lesson, we're going to be talking about IRA, 401k, 403b beneficiaries. Okay. And just when we're talking about the word beneficiary, what we're talking about is the benefactor. It's the person who's going to receive the money after, if you're the IRA owner, after you die. Or in the case of where we're talking about where you're a beneficiary, you are, perhaps your parent passed away, your spouse passed away, and they were the IRA owner, and now you're the beneficiary. And this is, like everything these days, more complicated than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And that's because of the Secure Act. So the first thing I want to share is that for when the IRA owner died 2019 and before, a different set of rules. And when the death came about 2020 or after, or as we look into the future, when you pass away on your IRA, how do you want to have your beneficiaries set up? What you're going to learn is something today where we can set these things up according to your wishes. Now, 2019 and before, the reason I'm talking about that now, because it's kind of like 3 years old, but you say, well, why are you showing that now? I've had a lot of people, clients, talk to me and say, am I doing something wrong? Because they hear about this 10-year rule for the non-spouse, non-eligible designated beneficiary. So, which is what an adult child is, that inherits from their parents. I just had a lady yesterday that where her mother died in 2011. She's been doing minimum distributions. She's been doing the non-spouse stretch, and they seem to go up a little bit every year, but she has no recalculation. And she was wondering, boy, have I been doing this right? Because it's been more than 10 years since mom died. Am I supposed to empty that IRA? And the answer is for any deaths 2019 and before, these old rules were grandfathered in. It would have been impossible for your parent to have anticipated some sort of change in the rules starting in 2020. So the IRS and the government, they just grandfather in the old rules. But under the Secure Act, any deaths 1/1/2020 and after, it falls under the new rules. So instead of being one of either a spouse or a non-spouse stretch, or being a non-person beneficiary, now you've got a whole bunch of stuff going on that is really what this video is about. And so we're going to talk about, so first of all, the spouse hasn't changed. So the IRS and the lawmakers, when it comes to IRA beneficiaries, it's best to be a spouse when a person, when the IRA owner dies. So in other words, like my wife is going to inherit my IRA, and she's going to be able to take minimum distributions basically the same way I was taking them, and she's going to be able to recalculate life expectancy. That hasn't changed under the Secure Act. So the whole idea is the money was accumulated in the IRA. It's designed to last for a person's lifetime, and the required minimum distributions that started at 72 are really set up to distribute the thing over a lifetime. And then when the account owner dies, but they leave a spouse behind and they're the sole beneficiary, they're going to give those same benefits to them. That hasn't changed, but everything else has. So if you are leaving your money by beneficiary in an IRA to your children and to others, brothers, sisters, that kind of thing, then you're going to really want to pay it close attention, because you now have the power to change this and to go in and change your beneficiaries and how they're set up, who gets what, and that sort of thing. And I don't suggest people start making those changes based upon this video. I just want to alert you to the possibility of changes. You need to consult a professional before you start anticipating tax law and minimum distribution laws and that sort of thing. And so after the Secure Act, you have a spouse, which is unchanged. You have a non-spouse which is anybody but the spouse, that is an eligible designated beneficiary, and we're going to define what that is, and then the rules for that person. And then you have a non-spouse, which is anybody but the spouse, and then you have another person which doesn't meet this eligible designated beneficiary. And then you have the non-person beneficiary, which is the estate, which, and a non-look-through trust. So if the named beneficiary is not a person, you're going to fall under these more strict rules, or they're going to, the entity is going to fall under more strict rules than a person would. So what I want to do is I want to go to Tom and show you the visual aid in the show notes that go along and support and give you a lot more information than this board does.
Yeah, and so if you've seen some of our more recent videos, we've started doing these show notes, and you can find them in the links below in the video description. It links you back to our website where you could also find these as well. But what it is really more detail and more supporting documents for the board here. And so the first one we're going to look at is what the rules were before 2019 or before 2020. So anyone who had an IRA and died 2019 or before, these are the rules that the beneficiaries are under. And like Hans was saying, is we have really three categories. We have a spouse, a non-spouse, and a non-person beneficiary. And so that was, there were differences. They weren't that complicated to keep track of. You're either a spouse or you're not. That's pretty clear. You're either a person or not, and that's pretty clear. What they have done when they passed the Secure Act is the second document we're going to look at is really going over the new rules of what does this bring into. And so now we've added another factor. It's like you're either a spouse or you're not. Now if you're not a spouse, now you're either a designated beneficiary or a non-designated beneficiary. And so, or an eligible designated beneficiary is another, the proper phrase. And so this chart here in the notes really goes over the rules, who falls under these categories, what rules do they have to follow, and those type of things. And so it is fairly complicated. To Hans's point, is really the reason we're doing this video is for people who are currently around. One, if you've had a spouse or someone die and leave you money, you need to know how to handle it. But more importantly, if you're still around and you're planning for this, you need to know how this is going to impact whoever's receiving your money, and that could change what your plans are. One of the big things that the IRS really got rid of is, and it was never designed to do this, but IRAs were designed for retirement, not to be a wealth transfer tool. And so bypassing this rule, they have really made it a very lousy way to pass wealth from one generation to the next because of this 10-year rule they brought into. And so, Hans, I don't know if you want to jump a little more into how those work, but those are some of the important reasons we need to think about.
Well, I do, because if you're a spouse, what I was talking about earlier, under Secure Act didn't really change much. And so you're allowed to stretch the distributions so you can take the minimum based upon your life expectancy, and then you can recalculate your life expectancy every year. And people say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means when you say your spouse was 80 when they died and you were 75, and now you inherited the IRA, and that was 10 years ago. Well, when you were 75, your life expectancy might have been 92. And so you only needed to take a little bit out. And then when you turn 76, your life expectancy might have been 93, and so on. And so if you're now 85, your life expectancy might be 99. I'm just pulling these numbers out. I mean, it's past 92. So what it has an effect of, you have to take a smaller amount out, and you don't ever have a year where your life expectancy is 0. So you're going to always have some money in that IRA if you only take the minimum. Now, generally, when people come to us, a spouse comes to us, or they're already our client, and they have this big inheritance, we're going to talk to them about draining the IRA faster, because now they have the same problem their spouse did, is they're going to be leaving, you're going to now be leaving this IRA to your children who are going to be non-spouse, non-eligible designated beneficiaries. So there's going to be an estate tax problem or a income tax problem on the IRA if there's a lot of money in there. So we may not take advantage of all this for every single person, but the spouses are really in good shape if this is part of an income plan where people are living off of this IRA and paying the taxes as they go along. This thing can be stretched over the spouse's whole lifetime. And so that's good. That was protected under the Secure Act. Now, they also created this non-spouse eligible designated beneficiary. So everybody but the spouse is, and they were showing ways, or they were creating ways we can get around this 10-year rule. And so they created this other class of people. This didn't exist before the Secure Act. And what we've got are minor children until 21. So if a person dies and they leave it to their children and they're minors, they get to be an eligible designated beneficiary until they're 21. And then, they'll be this, and they can do the stretch, essentially. Then you've got, and you can't do this with grandkids. That was an old way that we used to work, is we make the grandkids the beneficiaries, but they've kind of closed that loop. But you can still leave your IRA to your grandkids. They're just not going to get a special break as being minors. Disabled. So if the beneficiary is disabled, and it's a very strict definition of disability, but if they are disabled, they can be in this special class here. Chronically ill, which means that you need help with 2 of the 6 activities of daily living. If it's a brother or sister or one of your children who are chronically ill, they're going to be, and maybe they're not disabled, but they're chronically ill, so they're going to be able to be in this class of people, and they can stretch the IRA. Or a person who's not more than 10 years younger. So if you leave it to your brother or sister or that sort of thing, and they're not more than 10 years younger, they are an eligible designated beneficiary, and they can then stretch the IRA like you used to over their whole lifetime. So they've created these classes, but it's pretty hard to plan to fit into these unless you actually have a disabled child or a disabled brother or somebody, and you want to leave the IRA for their benefit. They're going to give them some special benefits. But most people, other than the spouse, they leave their IRAs to their children, who are now adult children, and they're going to fall in that category of non-spouse, non-eligible designated beneficiary, and they're going to fall into the 10-year rule. So it's kind of that simple. And the 10-year rule is still not terrible. I mean, you can stretch it over 10 years, but that entire IRA needs to be emptied by the end of the 10th year. And that's where this lady called me yesterday morning. We were talking about some other things, and she was watching my prior video on the 10-year rule. And she said, my mother died 11 years ago. Am I doing something wrong? Because there's still money in there. And I said, no, you were grandfathered under this, so you're okay. I still want to look into it and make sure you're on a good path, and we're going to, but you're applying a current rule to something that doesn't apply to you. But this is concerning. And then added to that, the IRS did not put out, they just put out the regulations, and there's still proposed regulations in February of 2022. And what those proposed regulations said, this class, the non-spouse, non-eligible designated beneficiary, they're not only under the 10-year rule, but if the deceased or the IRA owner who died 2020 or after was already under minimum distributions, so they were 72 and older, you now have to take some money out, let's leave it at that, during the first 10 years. It's a smallish amount, but you got to make those things. And there's some uncertainty over what people need to do. And we're going to know something by the end of the year. So if you have somebody, if you're the beneficiary of an IRA of somebody who died 2020 or after, you need to have a little blinking light that you need to follow throughout the year here, or you can just get in touch with us of, were you supposed to take some required minimum distributions in 2021? And you weren't supposed to take any in 2020, but were you supposed to take a little bit in 2021? And are you supposed to take something in 2022? And it's pretty clear you are, but the IRS just haven't told us how to deal with that yet. And then the worst class of beneficiary, or the most penal, is the non-person beneficiary. And where we see this coming up is people that just name the estate as the beneficiary. And we just see a lot of people do this maybe out of laziness, out of they don't want to make a decision. Maybe when they set up the IRA or 401k, they didn't have anybody. They weren't married. They didn't have any children. Maybe they were, but they just thought, well, I'll just put the estate down and then my will take care of that. Well, and it might, or it will. However, most of those same people don't usually have very good wills drawn up either. But what it's going to do is that money is going to be paid to the estate. And then when the estate distributes it, it's going to all be taxed. And if the state doesn't distribute it, if it takes 5 years or longer, because you could face delays, an estate has 5 years, or a trust or any non-person entity, they're under the 5-year rule. It just means the whole thing has to be distributed and somebody's got to pay taxes on it within 5 years. So this is the least desirable. The most desirable is to be the spouse. If you don't get to make this choice, but the most tax favorable would be the spouse. The next would be if you're an eligible designated beneficiary. And where most people fall, the next generation, are the children or adult children who are non-eligible designated beneficiaries. So what I really wanted you to get out of this is that you need to be thoughtful about who you name as the beneficiaries, and you really need to consult a professional. You need to make sure your beneficiaries are updated and accurate, and then you think about the taxes that your kids are going to pay. And what Tom said earlier is the IRS and the Secure Act have made an IRA a lousy wealth transfer vehicle. They all got a beneficiary, so it's got to go to somebody. But there's a lot of people that just look upon this whole process as their estate planning. This is how they're going to leave money to the next generation. And generally, there's much more tax favorable ways to do that. We'll talk about that in other videos. So what I want to share with you, I'm Hans Scheil.
And I'm Tom Griffith.
And we both thank you for listening.
Thank you.